Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to another installment of Rebel Without Applause, coming to you as it always does from this, my television studio apartment right here in the Wood of the Holly, under the sign, nestled in the little creative confines of Crotona, which was established in 1912, all of which overlooks the COVID-addled but still enchanted land of law. And today I have a very special guest. He comes to us from Stanford University. He's a history professor there, and he's also a playwright and a documentarian and a veteran of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which he wrote a book about called In Struggle, SNCC and the Black Awakening of the 1960s. And I have to say that this book was very important in my research when I wrote The Children, which is an account of the first 2 years of the SNCC experience in Nashville and then in Alabama. Additionally, Dr. Carson is also head of the Martin Luther King Research and Educational Institute located at Stanford University. So I'm sitting here connected with just a font of information and expertise and experience, and I'm so honored to have you here. So welcome, Professor Clayborne Carson, to my humble podcast. I so appreciate you being here.
It's good to talk to you.
I wanted to thank you first for being here, and secondly, some years ago, through the good offices of your son Malcolm, kindly read my screenplay, The Children, and I so appreciate that.
Well, it's good to talk to somebody who's knowledgeable about the areas I feel very strongly about, Bill.
Well, you've basically made it your life's work, and as I just revisited your biography, it started for you when you attended the March on Washington in 1963. You were, I guess, a young undergraduate at that time.
Yeah, I just finished my first year of college and went to, I guess the organization was the National Student Association meeting in Bloomington that year, and that's where I met Stokely Carmichael, among other people there. He was representing Howard University.
What year are we talking about?
1963, actually on the eve of the march, because I left directly from there and got a ride with the NAACP group that went from Indianapolis and an overnight bus ride to Washington.
And what was, first of all, the experience like of meeting Stokely Carmichael? I guess at that time, 1963, of course, he had already participated in the Freedom Rides and been to Parchman Prison, so he was a hardened warrior. What was that experience like for you meeting this, I guess, this icon at that time?
Well, he had a great impact on me because he seemed to represent everything I wanted to be as a student. He was articulate and came with a great deal of passion. You know, one of the things he was trying to do when I think back is get the National Student Association, which some schools were leaving because it was too liberal, he wanted to get them to actually approve the March on Washington, and was running into some people who are saying, well, that's political. You know, this organization has a lot of Southern chapters, and you know, at that time, some of the Southern schools were pulling out of the organization because it had this more liberal representation. And he was basically saying, look, if you guys are not even willing to support the march, you know, what you really should be doing is sending money to SNCC. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that was a long way beyond the predominant feelings within NSA.
So just for the people that don't know, SNCC was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They were really at the point of the spear in terms of the African-American freedom struggle in the early 1960s, but specifically out of Nashville first and then elsewhere. NSA, the National Students Association, where did they live in relationship to SNCC? I'm not sure about that.
Well, the National Student Association had been around for a while. It was just meant to be as a national organization for college students, and typically places where there was a student government organization, they would send representatives to the NSA meeting. But by the early 60s, it became, I guess, the center of dispute about whether these student organizations should support the civil rights cause. For me, it was obvious, you know, this was a student-led movement and they should be supporting that. But from the point of view of NSA, as I said, a lot of their chapters were in the South, at predominantly white schools. Uh-huh. And there was a strong feeling that they would all pull out, and a lot of them did because of NSA stand, even though NSA was not at all on the radical side of of things. It was a pretty cautious organization.
So it was a generic student organization. It wasn't necessarily associated with any progressive or social forms.
It was seen as liberal, but liberalism at that time did not necessarily mean supporting civil rights activism.
I know you went to UCLA and you've got some heavy roots here in Los Angeles, but at the time, I believe you were from New Mexico. Is that right?
Yeah, I just finished my first year at New Mexico, and that's where I grew up. So it made sense since I didn't have any funds to go to the state university.
Uh-huh.
And I transferred after my second year.
So that's New Mexico State. That makes you a Lobo, I guess, or what?
No, University of New Mexico.
Oh, University of New Mexico. Okay. And so that must have been a hugely eye-opening experience to come from a relatively, I guess, backwater place in terms of the civil rights movement to 200,000 people on the Mall in Washington. What was that like for you?
Yeah, it was kind of like seeing a large proportion of the population of the state. And certainly more Black people than I had seen in my life to that point. So it was definitely had a tremendous impact on me. And I don't know if I would be doing what I'm doing now if not for that experience. It was probably the first thing that I had ever done that I didn't even want to tell my parents that I was going.
Now, I read your biography. It said Los Alamos, and I just want to get this out of the way. Were they nuclear scientists by any chance? Or was that?
My father was a security inspector. And,
okay.
I actually was the one who later worked at the lab.
Is that right?
Yeah, I that was my summer job for a couple of summers, and
That's hilarious.
I played my role in terms of nuclear weapons research, and really didn't feel any guilt about it. It was an interesting job. I was thinking about becoming a scientist, and it was only later that I thought back and said, "My gosh, I spent a summer making a part on a hydrogen bomb."
You were there with Teller and Oppenheimer, and I guess
they were all gone by that time.
Okay.
Although Oppenheimer came back for a visit to the lab while I was there, so I saw him actually.
That's interesting. So you find yourself in. Did you go? I'm just curious. Were you at the Washington rally with Stokely Carmichael? Was he there in attendance?
Oh no. In fact, when I told him I was going to go to the march, he put that down. Like, why are you going to that picnic when you could be doing something important like going to Albany, Georgia, or Cambridge, Maryland, or some of the other places where SNCC was active.
And were you a member of SNCC? Was there a chapter in New Mexico at the University of New Mexico at that time?
No, there were a few students who were kind of active in the movement from a distance, and it was, let's see, this would have been 1963, so it was really during 1961 during the Freedom Rides that a few people went to take part in the Freedom Rides into Mississippi during that time, and they kind of were the, as you said, the spearhead of the movement.
Right. I had the very just huge privilege of spending about 2 years in James Lawson's workshops here at the Holman Methodist Church, and he had he spoke just at length about that. I always looked at it as this incredibly interesting Gandhian social experiment in the heart of the American South, and it was. He's just such an important figure. I think because of John Lewis's death, he's getting more national attention. But I look at him as right there on Mount Rushmore, in terms of the great figures.
Yeah, when you think back, that only about 24 people participated in his workshop in the late 1950s. But of those 24 people, John Lewis, Diane Nash, James Bevel, Bernard Lafayette, just C.T. Vivian,
Marion Barry.
Marion Barry. You could hardly think of how a small group of people could have that kind of impact on American history, really. The Freedom Rides would have never reached Mississippi except for that group. Diane Nash and James Lawson, C.T. Vivian. I mean, they were the ones who, after the Congress of Racial Equality said, this is getting too dangerous, this is suicidal.
Right.
They're the ones who said, well, this is where if it's suicidal, we're prepared to die.
Take it to Mississippi, because I just want to fill in some of the blanks for people that don't know. But those freedom rides originated in Washington, and they basically, they were when they got into Alabama, there was a huge fire, and then they were assaulted upon their arrival into Montgomery. And so the decision at that moment was, how do we continue? How do we make this thing go on? And I think that's the moment.
They didn't even get to Montgomery the first time. They got to Anniston, Alabama.
Right, that's where the fire occurred.
Firebombed.
Right, it was Anniston. And there were two buses. One of them was immolated in Anniston. I believe another one got to Birmingham, and then one of them made it to Montgomery, and that's where the big decision had to be made. And this is interesting because I know you're also the head of the Dr. King Research Institute at Stanford, but he has a very curious moment in his own career when he's asked to or pressured or requested to join them into Mississippi, and he for his own reasons decides that wouldn't be the prudent move at that moment for him. So
they wanted him to come with them into Alabama, and that would have made a lot of sense in some ways because that's where the movement started in Montgomery.
Right.
But he and his father both said, look, this is suicidal. That you guys are just going to get your heads beaten, and that's what happened. And Martin Luther King, in comparison to people like John Lewis and Bernard Lafayette and Diane Nash, he was reluctant to go to jail. He did on occasion, obviously, but the kind of SNCC attitude of this is our main weapon, because by that time, I guess by 1961, they had the philosophy of jail no bail.
Right.
If you went to jail, you would serve your sentence, and
pressure the system, like that's very Gandhian.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and by accepting bail, then you're kind of getting caught into, you need bail funds and all that sort of stuff. And they didn't have any of that. So they just said, look, if you go to jail, you stay in jail.
I know you've done tremendous amount of scholarship on Dr. King, but what would be something that most people really wouldn't know or wouldn't understand about his journey?
Well, I think the major thing is that we shouldn't see him as he certainly wasn't the spearhead of the movement. In fact, for many of us who kind of identified with SNCC, the feeling was he's catching up with us, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
We're not following him. For example, I went on to work at Los Angeles. And so in the 64, 65 of that period. And so when King came out during what we call the Watts Rebellion,
right,
it was more like, okay, we've been here for a year, now you're here. So he's following us. He's recognizing that the movement is not just Southern, it's Northern as well as Southern, and you have to take on these economic issues. So he did, but it wasn't like he was leading the way. When he finally did go to Chicago, he was joining a movement that had developed a certain amount of strength and its own leadership. And that was one of the problems, is that the local leaders in Chicago did not necessarily defer to him. And so in that sense, he was following, even with respect to Vietnam. It was
right.
SNCC who took a stand against the Vietnam War first, and he kind of followed that. And in fact, Coretta was speaking out against the war before Martin was.
How do you feel about making him a human or a deity?
Well, I think that historians look at documents,
mm-hmm.
and to be quite blunt about it, I mean, King produced a lot of documents that I've spent it'll take us longer to study his documents than it took him to live his life. and that's because there's, just think of all the people he wrote to, all the people who wrote to him, all the sermons that he gave, all the speeches that he gave. He was giving several hundred speeches a year and sermons. So there's a lot to go with. When I did my book on SNCC, I was searching in people's basement and going over to Howard Zinn's attic and
right,
going through these boxes of materials that had been sitting up there, and that was the SNCC papers.
And so you were more of a detective in terms of uncovering sort of the truth of the SNCC
Yeah, it
experience.
wasn't, I wasn't overwhelmed with documents.
Right.
I was searching for those documents, and with King, it was a kind of a different problem of just being overwhelmed with several 100,000 documents to study.
Now, you wrote a play about Dr. King, and I'm curious to know because I feel like I've had a couple feet in both worlds, meaning I've done all this research and kind of like drenched myself in this material, including your book and David Halberstam and a million others, and the great documentary that you worked on, Eyes on the Prize. It just and Lawson's workshops. But at some point, it has to become an exercise in your imagination. You have to actually reimagine it and try and experience it in a different way. What was that like for you when you wrote your play?
Well, I wouldn't have written the play except for Anna Devere Smith being at Stanford at that time. And I don't know if you know very much about her work, but
Who was this again?
Anna Devere Smith.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I've heard of her. Yeah.
And she had kind of almost invented this form of doing interviews and then performing the interviews as a play.
Mm-hmm.
And so she had started doing that. And I remember we had a conversation, and she said, look, you don't even have to do the interviews. You've got all these documents.
Yeah.
And I had already thought about the idea of doing what eventually became the autobiography of Martin Luther King. Because about the time I knew her, I was doing the Malcolm X FBI book. And so I was looking at all these FBI documents and, of course, getting very familiar with Alex Haley and his role in terms of the autobiography, essentially writing it. And they used to have interviews. So I thought, my gosh, if you did that with Malcolm, why can't I do that with King? And just bring together all the various documents in a narrative. And so the play was kind of along those lines. I was looking for characters, two relationships that really serve as the spine of it, as King's relationship with his father, and then, of course, his relationship with Coretta.
Interesting.
And using those as the threads that tie everything together. And you have such strong personalities. Daddy King is strong, Martin, Coretta. Each of them have their strong personalities that you could bring out on the stage. And then the confrontations with Malcolm and Stokely. And having the Stokely character there in the play was really fun because, I'd known him as a person. And I could actually put words in his mouth because I'd interviewed him.
Right.
And I had the record of the interviews. What did he think about Martin Luther King? How did all that sort of thing. And then Martin Luther King had written Where Do We Go From Here, which talked about his relationship with Stokely. So they could talk to each other. I could create a dialogue.
So you had all these building blocks at your sort of fingertips in terms of interviews and source material.
Yeah. And the same with Malcolm. Although what Malcolm thought of King is a little bit hard, so I basically have Martin listening to King and critiquing him. Those are really wonderful relationships to explore.
An interview that was so helpful for me in terms of understanding, well, a lot of the characters in my own script, but specifically Stokely, was the interview he did with Robert Penn Warren in 1966. And it really humanized him in a way. He actually seemed to me like sweet and really nice and was always looking to find common ground with the people that he was in contact with. And that really, there's this popular conception, at least, as like, oh my God, Black Power, this hard ass, when in fact the actual image that I got of him as a person was very different. And that really was the contradiction within him as a person that sort of animated how I tried to write him when he's in Parchman with John Lewis. These two very different figures kind of respecting and their clash of their own ideas and beliefs. But those interviews that Robert Penn Warren did, for me, were really helpful. And just for folks, Robert Penn Warren was a famous Southern author, and he wrote All the King's Men, which became an important movie loosely based on the life and times of Huey Long. But that interview was really helpful for me because it was also in 1966. So his memories of the events were fresh, and I don't think they've been calcified by having repeated them a lot of times.
Yeah. Well, it is always nice to get beyond the kind of the public person and look at these people more carefully, and you find out, they're human beings with vulnerabilities and all that sort of thing, and a certain amount of sometimes grudging, but respect for one another. For all of Malcolm's bombast, he didn't have to do that in Birmingham. He would have been one dead person there.
Yes.
So I think there was a recognition that it takes a certain amount of bravery. You can say things in Harlem that if you tried to say them in Birmingham, it would get you killed, at least publicly, if you tried to say that. And I think later on, Malcolm, one of the pictures I have is of Malcolm, I guess, in late '64. And there's a meeting at the Audubon Ballroom, and the special honored guest is Fannie Lou Hamer.
Right.
And he's telling his followers, look, she's a heroic figure, and eventually we are going to be sending you into the South and carrying on the struggle.
Now, for those that don't know, Fannie Lou Hamer was a voting rights activist, a woman from Mississippi who was, I guess, recruited in the sort of Robert Moses iteration when they came down there to organize for voting rights, and she became a very important leader. And I guess I always felt like the climax of her career would have been that political convention in 1964 when they're trying to get the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegation certified for the convention. But she was just a huge figure. Yeah.
Very articulate, and, just someone with, just a grammar school education who was one of the leading figures of the Southern struggle.
Now, that sort of dovetails into another idea about the relationship between the talented 10th, or these elites that are formulating and developing these ideas, and then just the working poor, the people on the other side of the spectrum who are, in a way, the foot soldiers. That relationship seems like it's always in play.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And it was one of the sources of tension within SNCC, because their philosophy was grassroots leadership. But the reality was that Northern students, black and white, came to the South with a lot of educational advantages. And so there had to be a conscious effort to allow that grassroots leadership room to grow. And eventually it did, but there was a tension because, you're at a meeting with people who are very articulate. Those who are less confident are likely to sit and listen. And then you don't get indigenous leadership to develop. There's always this dependence. I mean, it even gets down to who can use the technology, who can use the typewriter, who can type a memo, things like that. And that was the source of a lot of the tension that happened as the movement developed. There was a recognition that you just have to get out of the way and let people from the community run for office, do all the things that eventually they did.
Yeah.
And sometimes you had to get the outsiders to step aside. Or sometimes the outsiders became insiders and made a long-term commitment to stay there.
I got the feeling that happened in Selma long before the march when James Bevel and Bernard Lafayette arrived there. And there's a local movement for voting rights. And I'm sure the dance they had to do with the locals must have been delicate.
Yeah.
This is such a deep subject. I really appreciate you coming. Thanks so much for joining me.
Good to talk to you.
Bye-bye. Bye. So there you have it, folks. A very compelling discussion with Professor Clayborne Carson about SNCC and the Black Awakening of the 1960s. I wanted to extend an invitation to any and all to check out my screenplay, which is about the same subject matter, includes the same characters that we discussed today. It's my adaptation of David Halberstam's book of the same title. That's The Children. Reach out to me through social media, and I'm happy to send it along. Just trying to share the story. Till next time, folks. Namaste, shalom, and aloha. Namashaloha.